Trash like you doesn't belong in civilized places. Those words would end Chief Sarah Thompson's career in the most devastating way imaginable. Judge Marcus Washington approached the courthouse steps in his civilian clothes, a leather briefcase containing judicial orders clutched in his hand. The morning sun cast long shadows as he walked with quiet dignity toward his own building. But Chief Sarah Thompson saw only what her prejudice allowed her to see. "Another thug thinking he can just waltz into government property," Thompson snarled, blocking his path with her imposing frame. At 5'8" and 180 pounds, she was a commanding presence who had learned to use intimidation as her primary tool. Her 15 years on the force had taught her that authority was often more effective than actual police work. "This ain't no welfare office, boy. You lost or just looking to cause trouble?" Her eyes fixed on Marcus's professional briefcase with contempt rather than curiosity. She saw what she wanted to see, another black man who didn't belong in her domain. Marcus stopped walking, his expression calm but alert. He had dealt with difficult people throughout his 25 years on the federal bench, but this was different. This was personal hatred masquerading as law enforcement, and he recognized the danger immediately. "Excuse me, Chief," he replied politely, reading her nameplate while adjusting his grip on the briefcase. "I'm here on official business." "If you'd like to see my identification, official business?" Thompson's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Brother, the only business you got here is the kind that lands you in handcuffs. This is a federal courthouse, not some community center where you people can just wander around causing problems." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been challenged, never been held accountable, never faced consequences for her actions. Other officers, Rodriguez and Davis, emerged from nearby positions, drawn by the confrontation like sharks, sensing blood in the water. "He thinks he belongs here, Chief," Officer Rodriguez called out, already pulling out her phone to record what she assumed would be another routine humiliation. "These people never learn." "Do they?" Thompson's eyes gleamed with the kind of hatred that had been festering for years, waiting for the perfect victim. "Official business," she repeated mockingly. "Let me guess. You're a lawyer, a judge, maybe a senator." Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "That's what they all claim when they get caught where they don't belong." Marcus felt the familiar weight of systemic racism bearing down on him, but he maintained his composure. "Chief, I simply need to enter the courthouse. If you'd examine my credentials—" "The only credentials you need are an arrest record," Thompson snarled, stepping closer. "And you're about to get one." What happened next would be recorded by multiple security cameras, preserved forever as evidence of the moment when Chief Sarah Thompson committed the biggest mistake of her entire career. Her open palm cracked across Marcus's face with such force that his head snapped sideways. The expensive briefcase flew from his grip, legal documents and judicial orders scattering across the stone steps, like evidence of her future destruction. The sound of the impact echoed off the courthouse walls, a sharp crack that would soon echo through her nightmares. Thompson grabbed his throat with both hands, her fingers digging into his neck as she slammed him back against the courthouse wall. The bronze nameplate 20 feet above them read, "The Honorable Judge M. Washington presiding." But Thompson was too blinded by her own prejudice to notice the cosmic irony of her actions. "Trash like you doesn't belong in civilized places," she growled, her face inches from his. Spittle flew from her lips as she spoke, her hatred raw and undisguised. "Time to learn some respect for law and order." Metal handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as she twisted his arms behind his back with unnecessary force. The other officers circled like vultures, their phones recording what they thought was routine police work. They had no idea they were documenting the assault of a federal judge, creating evidence that would soon destroy all their careers. "So another uppity one thinking he can just walk into any building he wants." Officer Davis laughed, kicking at the scattered legal documents. "Look at all this fake paperwork. These criminals are getting more creative with their scams." Marcus's jaw throbbed where Thompson's hand had connected, but his mind remained sharp and focused. He was 15 feet from his own courtroom, being brutalized by officers who would soon learn exactly who controlled their professional destiny. The irony was suffocating, but Thompson was about to discover that justice has its own way of correcting imbalances. If you believe that no one should ever face racial profiling and police brutality like this, type justice below. Then comment your country and city. Let's see where people stand against discrimination worldwide. Your participation shows that accountability knows no borders. As Thompson dragged him up the courthouse steps, Marcus took mental notes of every face, every laugh, every person who would soon learn the true meaning of accountability. The game had begun, and Thompson had no idea she was about to lose everything. Inside the courthouse, Chief Thompson felt the familiar rush of power that came with a successful arrest. Every eye was on her. Every whisper was about her latest demonstration of authority. Security guards nodded approvingly. Court clerks stepped aside with respectful deference. This was her domain, her kingdom, and she had just reminded everyone who was really in charge. "Another one for processing, Sergeant Williams," Thompson announced to the desk sergeant, her chest puffed with pride. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins, making her feel invincible. Attempted breach of courthouse security, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. Sergeant Williams barely looked up from his paperwork. After 12 years of processing Thompson's arrests, this was just another routine booking. Same old story, different day. What's the background on this one? Subject was acting suspiciously around the courthouse entrance. Thompson began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had never been questioned. Carrying what appeared to be forged legal documents, claimed to have legitimate business in the building. When I attempted to verify his identity, he became combative and physically aggressive. The lies flowed from her mouth like water, each fabrication building on the last to create a narrative that fit perfectly with her prejudices and the system's expectations. Thompson had perfected this art over 15 years of police work, learning exactly which details to emphasize and which to omit. In the courthouse holding area, Marcus sat quietly on a metal bench, his professional clothes wrinkled from Thompson's assault. The handcuffs were too tight, cutting off circulation to his fingers. But he had experienced worse discomfort during his years as a federal prosecutor. His mind was racing through the legal implications of what was happening, cataloging every violation of procedure and constitutional right. He thought about the Supreme Court cases that applied to his situation: Terry v. Ohio regarding reasonable suspicion, Miranda v. Arizona regarding his rights during arrest, Brady v. Maryland regarding the preservation of evidence. As a federal judge with 25 years of experience, he had presided over thousands of cases involving police misconduct. He had sentenced countless defendants, listened to endless testimonies, and witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior. But he had never experienced the system from this side. Never felt the dehumanizing weight of being processed like a common criminal. Never sat in a cell, wondering if justice would prevail or if corruption would triumph once again. The irony of his situation was almost overwhelming. Thompson had assaulted a federal judge 20 feet from his own courtroom. She had destroyed legal documents that he had personally authored and signed. She had handcuffed the man who had the constitutional authority to sentence her to decades in federal prison. His phone, confiscated during the arrest, contained direct numbers to the FBI Civil Rights Division, the Attorney General's office, and every major legal authority in the state. His briefcase, now tagged as evidence in Thompson's fabricated case, contained sensitive judicial documents that only a sitting federal judge would have legitimate access to. But most importantly, Thompson was about to commit perjury in front of the one person who had both the power and the knowledge to destroy her entire career with a single revelation. "Thompson's got another live one," Officer Rodriguez announced to the gathering crowd of law enforcement. This one was particularly delusional, claimed to be some kind of judge or lawyer, had a whole briefcase full of fake documents to support his story. Officer Davis laughed as she scrolled through the video on her phone. "These people watch too much TV. They think if they act professional and use big words, we'll just let them walk into any building they want. Doesn't work that way in the real world." The casual racism in their conversation was breathtaking in its openness. Years of unchecked authority had made them comfortable expressing their prejudices publicly, confident that the system would always protect them regardless of their actions. "What's the usual outcome for cases like this?" asked a young officer who was new to the courthouse detail. "Open and shut," Thompson replied confidently. "Judge will see right through his act. These people always get the maximum sentence because they waste everyone's time with their sob stories and false accusations. The system doesn't tolerate this kind of disrespect." Thompson had no idea that the system she was referring to was embodied by the man sitting in handcuffs just 20 feet away. She had no idea that her victim was actually the person who controlled every aspect of her professional life, from the warrants she requested to the testimony she gave to the cases she built. As the processing continued, Marcus remained perfectly calm, but anyone looking closely would have noticed the slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. He was taking mental notes of every detail, every violation, every word that would soon be used as evidence in the federal prosecution that would destroy Thompson's life. Chief Thompson had no idea that the most dangerous predator in the courthouse was sitting quietly in her holding cell, taking careful notes while she dug her own professional grave deeper with every lie she told. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and she had no idea the trap was already being set. In the courthouse's administrative wing, Chief Thompson began crafting the narrative that would make or break her case. This was an art form she had perfected over 15 years of police work, the delicate balance of truth and fiction that transformed messy reality into clean legal proceedings. The key was confidence, specific details that couldn't be easily verified, and a story that fit perfectly with the prejudices and expectations of judges and prosecutors. Thompson had learned that the system was designed to believe police officers, especially when those officers were testifying against defendants who looked like Marcus Washington. "Let me walk you through the incident report," Thompson said to prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, a middle-aged woman who had worked with her on dozens of cases over the years. Subject approached the courthouse at approximately 8:45 a.m., displaying suspicious behavior consistent with attempted security breach. Walsh nodded approvingly as she took notes. Thompson's arrests had an impressive conviction rate, and she had learned to trust her judgment about these matters. Her cases were always well documented, her testimony was always credible, and her arrests usually resulted in guilty pleas that kept her caseload manageable. "What specific behaviors did you observe?" Walsh asked, her pen poised to capture the details that would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. "Subject was dressed inappropriately for legitimate court business," Thompson began, her voice taking on the professional tone she used for official reports. "He was carrying an expensive briefcase that appeared inconsistent with his apparent socioeconomic status, suggesting possible theft or fraud. Each lie was carefully calculated, designed to plant seeds of doubt about Marcus's credibility while reinforcing stereotypes that would make the prosecutor and judge more likely to accept her version of events. When I approached to investigate, the subject became increasingly agitated and verbally abusive. He claimed to have legitimate business in the courthouse, but refused to provide proper identification when requested." Thompson pulled out her notebook, flipping to a page where she had hastily scribbled fabricated details during the booking process. "Subject made several threatening statements, including claims that I would regret stopping him and that I didn't know who I was dealing with. Classic deflection tactics we see from repeat offenders. The irony of that last statement was so profound it was almost suffocating. Thompson was absolutely correct that she didn't know who she was dealing with, but not in the way she intended. "Did the subject attempt to flee when you tried to detain him?" Walsh asked, already anticipating the standard elements that would need to be proven in court. "Absolutely. When I attempted to place him in protective custody for everyone's safety, he became physically combative. He swung at my face, attempted to kick me, and actively resisted being handcuffed. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to subdue his aggressive behavior." Thompson's fabrication was becoming more elaborate with each sentence, transforming her brutal assault into a heroic act of self-defense. She had told similar stories so many times that the lies came naturally, flowing from her mouth with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Marcus was using his legal knowledge to analyze every aspect of his situation. As a former federal prosecutor who had specialized in civil rights cases, he understood exactly what Thompson was trying to accomplish with her false narrative. He also understood something Thompson didn't. Every lie she told under oath would become evidence in the federal prosecution that would soon destroy her career. Perjury was a serious felony, especially when committed by a law enforcement officer in the commission of other crimes. His phone calls during booking had been monitored and recorded, as was standard procedure. But Thompson had no idea that Marcus's first call had been to Chief Judge Patricia Carter, alerting her to preserve all surveillance footage from the courthouse cameras. His second call had been to the FBI Civil Rights Division, formally requesting an investigation into Thompson's conduct. The federal machinery of justice was already in motion, but Thompson was too focused on her immediate tactical victory to recognize the strategic disaster she was creating for herself. "What about the documents he was carrying?" Walsh asked, flipping through the evidence photos. "Clearly forged," Thompson replied without hesitation. "Legal papers, case files, judicial memoranda, materials that no ordinary citizen would have legitimate access to. We believe he was planning some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme, possibly targeting court personnel." The documents were, of course, completely authentic. Marcus had personally authored most of them, signed them and filed them through official channels. But Thompson's prejudice made it impossible for her to recognize obvious signs of authenticity. "This appears to be a clear-cut case," Walsh concluded, closing her folder with satisfaction. "Trespassing, assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and attempted fraud. The defendant's claims about being a judge or lawyer are obviously desperate attempts to avoid accountability." Thompson smiled with grim satisfaction. Another case, another victory, another reminder that the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. People knew their place, or they learned it the hard way. She had no idea that in a few hours she would learn exactly what her place was in the hierarchy of justice. The temporary courtroom was packed, with the usual morning crowd of lawyers, defendants, court staff, and curious observers drawn by whispers of an unusual case. Judge Robert Parker, filling in for the mysteriously absent Judge Washington, called the session to order with the efficient manner of someone accustomed to handling routine criminal matters. Judge Parker was a thin, pale man in his 60s who prided himself on running an efficient courtroom. He had been told that Judge Washington was dealing with an emergency situation and would be unavailable for the morning docket, but he had no idea that the emergency was currently sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table. "Case number 2024 CR 8847, the clerk announced with practiced monotony. "State versus John Doe, defendant." The use of John Doe was another calculated insult. Despite Marcus's attempts to provide proper identification, Thompson had listed him as an unknown subject, further dehumanizing him and reinforcing the narrative that he was exactly the kind of person who belonged in the defendant's chair. Chief Sarah Thompson approached the witness stand with the supreme confidence of a woman who had testified hundreds of times without ever being seriously challenged. Her uniform was pressed to military precision, her badge polished to a brilliant shine, and her bearing projected the kind of professional authority that judges and juries found immediately credible. She had learned over 15 years of police work that perception was often more important than reality in courtroom proceedings. A confident officer with a compelling narrative could overcome almost any defense, especially when the defendant fit certain demographic profiles that made judges and prosecutors predisposed to believe the worst. "Chief Thompson," Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh began, her voice carrying the respectful tone that law enforcement officers had learned to expect from the justice system, "please tell the court about the events that led to this arrest." Thompson cleared her throat and settled into her testimony with the practiced ease of a professional performer. Every gesture was calculated, every pause was deliberate, every detail was designed to reinforce her credibility while undermining Marcus's. "Your Honor, at approximately 8:45 this morning, I was conducting routine security protocols at the courthouse entrance when I observed the defendant engaging in suspicious behavior consistent with attempted unauthorized access to government property." In the defendant's chair, Marcus sat perfectly still, his handcuffed hands folded in his lap despite the metal restraints. The bruise on his cheek from Thompson's assault was clearly visible, but her narrative was already working to reframe even that evidence to support her fabricated version of events. The defendant appeared to be conducting surveillance of the courthouse entrance, Thompson continued, warming to her story. He was carrying what appeared to be stolen or forged legal documents, and his behavior suggested he was preparing to attempt some kind of fraud or security breach. Judge Parker leaned forward with interest, drawn into Thompson's compelling narrative. What specifically made you suspicious, Chief Thompson? Several factors, Your Honor. First, the defendant was dressed inappropriately for legitimate court business, but he was carrying an expensive briefcase that seemed inconsistent with his apparent socio-economic status. Second, he was loitering near the courthouse entrance in a manner consistent with criminal reconnaissance. Each lie was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt, while reinforcing stereotypes that would make her story more believable. Thompson had learned that successful police testimony wasn't just about facts. It was about creating a narrative that fit the audience's expectations and prejudices. When I approached to investigate, Thompson continued, her voice taking on the tone of a patient professional dealing with an unreasonable subject, the defendant immediately became hostile and evasive. He refused to provide proper identification and began making increasingly aggressive demands to enter the courthouse. Marcus's jaw clenched as he listened to each fabrication, each distortion of reality that transformed his polite request for entry into aggressive demands. But he remained silent, taking mental notes of every lie that would soon become evidence in Thompson's federal prosecution. The defendant claimed to be a lawyer, then a judge, then said he worked in the building. Thompson continued, her voice dripping with contempt. It's a classic deflection tactic we see from repeat offenders who think they can talk their way out of accountability. From the gallery, Officers Rodriguez and Davis exchanged knowing looks. They had heard Thompson tell variations of this story dozens of times before, different faces, but the same essential narrative. The system always believed cops over criminals, especially when those criminals looked like Marcus Washington. What was the defendant's demeanor during this interaction? Prosecutor Walsh asked, setting up the foundation for the assault charges. Increasingly agitated and threatening, Your Honor. He kept insisting that I would regret stopping him, that I didn't know who I was dealing with. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation by explaining courthouse security procedures, he became physically aggressive. Thompson paused for effect, letting the tension build in the courtroom. Chief Thompson had no idea that his confident testimony was actually digging her own grave deeper with every lie, creating a permanent legal record that would soon become crucial evidence in her federal prosecution. Thompson was hitting her stride now, her fabricated testimony flowing like a well-rehearsed performance. Years of successful prosecutions had taught her exactly which details to emphasize, which emotions to project, and which buttons to push to ensure that judges and juries accepted her version of events without question. Chief Thompson, Prosecutor Walsh continued, can you describe the specific nature of the defendant's physical aggression? Absolutely, Your Honor. After the defendant realized that his verbal intimidation wasn't working, he escalated to physical violence. He swung his fist at my face, forcing me to block the attack with my defensive hand. Thompson demonstrated the motion for the court, her movements precise and professional. What she was describing as defensive action was actually the brutal backhand that had left a purple bruise on Marcus's cheek, but her confident presentation made her version seem credible. When I attempted to secure his hands for everyone's safety, he kicked at my legs and continued struggling violently. At that point, I realized I was dealing with someone who posed a genuine threat to courthouse security. Judge Parker nodded gravely, completely drawn into Thompson's narrative. What measures did you take to control the situation? I used the minimum force necessary to subdue the defendant's aggressive behavior, Your Honor. I secured his hands with department-issued restraints and immediately called for backup to ensure the safety of everyone in the area. Thompson's lies were becoming more elaborate and more confident with each sentence. She had discovered years ago that the key to successful police testimony was commitment to the narrative, regardless of how far it diverged from reality. I want to emphasize to the court, Thompson continued, that I showed remarkable restraint during this encounter. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of controlled substances. A less experienced officer might have used much more significant force to control his aggressive behavior. Marcus almost smiled at the absurdity of Thompson's claims. As a federal judge who had presided over hundreds of police misconduct cases, he recognized every element of her standard playbook. Claim victim was aggressive, emphasize officer restraint, suggest drug use without evidence, and present brutality as professional law enforcement. Chief Thompson, Judge Parker interjected, in your professional opinion, what motivated the defendant's behavior? Thompson's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of question that allowed her to present her prejudices as professional expertise. Your Honor, in my 15 years of law enforcement experience, I've encountered this pattern many times before. Certain individuals believe they're entitled to special treatment, that rules don't apply to them. When confronted with legitimate authority, they immediately resort to claims of discrimination or police brutality. Her voice rose with righteous indignation, perfectly calibrated to appeal to the judge's sense of justice and order. It's honestly insulting to the real victims of discrimination, Your Honor. This defendant is trying to weaponize serious social issues to deflect from his own criminal behavior. He knows that if he can make this about race rather than his actual crimes, he might be able to manipulate public sympathy. Several people in the gallery, mostly courthouse employees who had worked with Thompson for years, nodded in agreement. Her narrative felt familiar and comfortable, reinforcing their existing beliefs about crime, justice, and social order. Thompson pulled out her phone, swiping to a video that conveniently started mid-confrontation. I have partial footage here, Your Honor, though unfortunately my body camera experienced a technical malfunction this morning. The lie rolled off her tongue like honey. Thompson had learned that claiming equipment malfunctions was often more believable than having no video evidence at all, and it allowed her to present carefully edited footage that supported her narrative while concealing her actual crimes. However, this cell phone video clearly shows the defendant's combative behavior and my professional response to his aggression. Marcus knew that Thompson's technical malfunction claim was completely false. He also knew that her body camera footage was automatically backed up to county servers every 60 seconds, regardless of any local equipment issues. But Thompson was apparently unaware of the backup systems that would soon expose her lies. Officer Rodriguez, Prosecutor Walsh called. Can you corroborate Chief Thompson's testimony? Officer Rodriguez stood with military precision, her uniform immaculate and her expression serious. Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident from approximately 50 feet away. Chief Thompson handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint. Marcus watched as the web of lies expanded, each supporting testimony making Thompson's eventual downfall more devastating. Rodriguez had been one of the officers laughing and recording on her phone while he was being brutalized, but now she was presenting herself as a credible witness to Thompson's professionalism. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols, Rodriguez continued with practiced authority. His behavior was erratic and confrontational from the moment Chief Thompson approached him. He seemed determined to gain access to restricted areas through intimidation and false claims. The systematic perjury was breathtaking in its scope and coordination. 3 police officers were now on record creating a false narrative about assaulting a federal judge. Judge Parker leaned forward attentively. And the alleged assault on Chief Thompson? Your Honor, I personally observed the defendant swing at Chief Thompson's face and attempt to kick her when she tried to secure his hands for everyone's safety. Chief Thompson showed incredible restraint in dealing with such aggressive behavior. The systematic perjury was breathtaking in its scope and coordination. 3 police officers were now on record, under oath, telling coordinated lies about assaulting a federal judge. They had transformed their criminal assault into heroic law enforcement, their victim into a dangerous criminal, and their perjury into professional testimony. But Marcus knew something they didn't. Every word of their false testimony was being recorded by the court stenographer, creating a permanent legal record that would soon become crucial evidence in their federal prosecution for conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations. Officer Davis, Prosecutor Walsh called next, completing the triumvirate of perjury that would soon destroy 3 law enforcement careers simultaneously. What did you observe regarding the defendant's alleged possession of fraudulent documents? Officer Davis approached the witness stand with the same rehearsed confidence as her colleagues. At 32 years old, she was a veteran officer who had quickly learned that supporting Thompson's narratives was essential for career advancement within their department. Your Honor, I can confirm everything my colleagues have testified to regarding the defendant's suspicious behavior and aggressive assault on Chief Thompson, Davis began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been seriously questioned about her version of events. But I want to focus specifically on the evidence that suggests this was a premeditated criminal conspiracy rather than a spontaneous incident. Judge Parker's eyebrows rose with interest. The suggestion of premeditation would significantly impact sentencing if Marcus were convicted, potentially adding years to any prison term. The defendant was carrying what appeared to be a sophisticated collection of forged legal documents, Davis continued, gesturing toward the evidence table where Marcus's briefcase contents had been displayed. Case files, judicial memoranda, administrative correspondence, materials that only court personnel would have legitimate access to. Marcus wanted to laugh at the cosmic irony. Davis was describing his own case files, his own judicial orders, his own administrative correspondence as forged documents. The woman was so ignorant of basic courthouse procedures that she couldn't recognize authentic judicial materials when they were directly in front of her. In my professional opinion, Davis continued, the defendant was clearly planning to impersonate court personnel or attempt some kind of sophisticated fraud scheme. The quality of these forgeries suggests significant resources and preparation. Thompson nodded approvingly from the prosecutor's table. Davis was exceeding expectations, adding layers of criminality that would make Marcus's situation even more desperate and his eventual punishment more severe. Officer Davis, Judge Parker interjected, what specific elements of these documents aroused your suspicion? Davis picked up one of Marcus's authentic case files, holding it like contaminated evidence. Your Honor, this document contains sensitive information about pending court cases, including confidential judicial deliberations and private attorney-client communications. No ordinary citizen would have access to materials like this. The document Davis was holding contained Marcus's own handwritten notes from a case he had presided over the previous week. His judicial seal was clearly visible on the letterhead, his signature was authentic, and the case numbers corresponded to legitimate entries in the court's database. But Davis's prejudice made it impossible for her to recognize obvious signs of authenticity. She saw what she expected to see, a black man with fraudulent documents rather than a federal judge with legitimate materials. Furthermore, Davis continued, warming to her fabrication, the defendant's behavior when confronted about these documents was consistent with someone who knew he was engaged in criminal activity. He became evasive when asked about their origin and refused to explain how he had obtained such sensitive materials. Marcus had actually tried multiple times to explain that the documents were authentic and that he had legitimate access to them through his position as a federal judge. But Thompson had refused to examine his credentials or listen to his explanations before initiating her assault. The sophistication of this fraud scheme, Davis concluded, suggests that the defendant may be part of a larger criminal organization targeting the judicial system. I recommend that this court consider the broader implications of his actions when determining appropriate punishment. Prosecutor Walsh smiled with satisfaction as she prepared to wrap up the state's case. The testimony had exceeded her expectations, painting a picture of a dangerous criminal who posed a significant threat to courthouse security and judicial integrity. Your Honor, Walsh announced with confidence, the state believes the evidence clearly demonstrates not just individual criminal behavior, but a coordinated attack on the foundations of our justice system. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is obviously a calculated defense strategy designed to distract from the serious nature of his crimes. Thompson allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. This was exactly how these cases were supposed to go. Professional police testimony, credible evidence, and a defendant who had no realistic defense against the combined authority of 3 sworn officers. She had no idea how completely wrong she was about to be proven. "Officer Thompson," Judge Parker said, "is there anything else you'd like to add to your testimony before we hear from the defendant?" Thompson couldn't resist one final moment of triumph. She stood slowly, her chest puffed with righteous authority, and addressed the court with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for her actions. "Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement, Your Honor. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences, and I hope this court will send a clear message that attacks on law enforcement and the judicial system will not be tolerated." She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that she had just delivered her own epitaph as a law enforcement officer. The trap was set, the lies were on record, and Marcus Washington was about to spring the most devastating reversal in courthouse history. "The state rests its case against this defendant," Prosecutor Walsh announced with supreme confidence. "The evidence clearly shows criminal trespass, assault on police officers, resisting arrest, and attempted fraud. We recommend the maximum penalty to send a clear message about the consequences of attacking law enforcement." As Thompson stepped down from the witness stand, she caught Marcus's eye one final time. The smirk she gave him was a gesture of complete dominance, total victory, and absolute confidence that justice had been served. It would be the last moment of triumph in her entire career. Judge Parker adjusted his glasses and looked toward the defendant's table with the weary expression of someone preparing to hear desperate lies from a convicted criminal. "The defendant may now present his statement, though I should note that the evidence against you appears quite substantial." Marcus Washington rose slowly from his chair, the handcuffs clinking softly as he moved. Despite the purple bruise on his cheek and the disheveled state of his clothes from Thompson's assault, he carried himself with an unmistakable dignity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Something about his presence was different from the typical defendants who appeared in this courtroom. His posture was erect but not defensive, his expression was calm but not resigned, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire room. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight that made Judge Parker look up from his notes with sudden attention. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." There was something in his tone that was unexpected, professional in a way that didn't match the narrative he'd been presented. His diction was precise, his grammar was flawless, and his bearing suggested someone who was comfortable addressing courts rather than being judged by them. "First," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone completely familiar with legal proceedings, "I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Chief Thompson's testimony." His eyes swept the courtroom methodically, landing on each person who had supported the officer's lies. The quality of his speech, the precision of his language, the confidence in his bearing. Nothing matched the profile of the desperate criminal Thompson had described. According to her statement, "I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk, approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. He turned slightly, addressing Judge Parker directly with the kind of natural authority that made him lean forward unconsciously. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague-Wurth, Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The court stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. This wasn't the rambling emotional outburst they'd expected from someone facing serious criminal charges. His citation was accurate. His legal reasoning was sound, and his delivery was that of someone who had spent years arguing constitutional law. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "Chief Thompson testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely." He gestured toward the evidence table where his scattered papers had been collected, his movement graceful despite the handcuffs that restricted his motion. "Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Judge Parker's expression was shifting from dismissive to concerned. Professional capacity? And what exactly is your profession, Mr.? Marcus paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth that made Thompson feel the first chill of genuine fear creeping down her spine. Chief Thompson had no idea that her confident prosecution was about to become the foundation of her own destruction, but Marcus knew exactly what was coming next. Washington. Mr. Washington. And I think we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor. The confidence in his voice, the legal terminology he was using with perfect precision, the way he carried himself despite the handcuffs, nothing was matching Thompson's assumptions about who he was supposed to be. Your Honor, if I may continue, Marcus said, his voice taking on the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades giving orders in courtrooms rather than receiving them. Chief Thompson also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity during our encounter. He paused, letting the tension build in the silent courtroom. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during the alleged incident. However, I will note that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. The young law clerk in the back row sat up straighter. Something about this man's voice, his mannerisms, his natural command of legal procedure, seemed familiar in a way that was making her increasingly uncomfortable. Now, regarding Chief Thompson's claim that her body camera malfunctioned, Marcus continued, and now there was steel in his voice that made several court officers shift nervously. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, which allows for the introduction of comprehensive summaries when dealing with voluminous electronic records. Judge Parker was leaning forward now, his expression shifting from routine boredom to deep concern as he began to realize this was not a typical case. I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court through proper legal channels. Thompson's face was beginning to lose color. Her confident smirk was fading as she started to understand that something was going very wrong with what should have been a routine conviction. What kind of evidence are you referring to? Judge Parker asked, his voice tight with growing apprehension. Marcus's eyes gleamed with something that looked like barely contained satisfaction. Your Honor, this courthouse has extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition digital cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach, all connected to centralized recording systems with automatic backup protocols. Thompson felt her stomach drop as she realized she had completely forgotten about the courthouse security cameras in her rush to control the narrative through false testimony. Additionally, Marcus continued with devastating precision, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body camera footage, uploaded to secure cloud storage every 60 seconds, regardless of any claimed local equipment malfunctions. His voice was taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture on legal procedure to students who should have known better. I would like to formally request that this court issue an immediate preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m., including but not limited to courthouse security footage, officer body camera backup files, and any mobile phone recordings that may have been made by law enforcement personnel present at the scene. Prosecutor Walsh stood abruptly, her confidence evaporating as she realized the case was spiraling beyond her control. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Marcus turned to face the prosecutor with a look that made Walsh take an involuntary step backward. There was something in Marcus's eyes that suggested he was far more dangerous than anyone in the courtroom had realized. Your Honor, pro se defendants have the fundamental constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland clearly establishes the prosecution's affirmative obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. The silence in the courtroom was becoming deafening. This was not how these cases usually proceeded. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength and authority with each word, Giglio v. United States requires the disclosure of any evidence that might impeach the credibility of prosecution witnesses, particularly law enforcement officers who may have provided false testimony under oath. Judge Parker cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Washington, you seem unusually familiar with complex legal procedure and constitutional law. Do you have formal legal training? Marcus's smile was becoming more pronounced, though it didn't reach his eyes. I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. His response was carefully neutral, but his eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like amusement at the cosmic irony of the situation. He walked as much as the handcuffs would allow to the evidence table and gestured toward his scattered belongings with the kind of natural authority that made everyone in the courtroom unconsciously defer to his movements. Your Honor, I'd also like to address Chief Thompson's characterization of my presence at this courthouse as suspicious or unauthorized. Marcus pointed to a specific document among the papers scattered on the evidence table, his movement precise, despite the restraints limiting his mobility. This is my daily court calendar, which clearly shows I was scheduled to preside over... I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate judicial business starting at 9:00 a.m. this morning. Bailiff Henderson, a large man who had worked in this courthouse for 18 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Marcus with growing recognition and horror, his face turning ashen as the implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. Chief Thompson testified that I claimed to be someone important, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtroom proceedings. I'd like to clarify that I never made any such specific claims during our brief encounter. He paused, surveying the courtroom with the kind of commanding presence that made everyone unconsciously straighten in their seats. However, I did attempt repeatedly to show Chief Thompson my official identification, which she refused to examine, before initiating her unprovoked physical assault. Thompson was sweating now, her confident demeanor cracking as she began to realize that something was going terribly wrong with what should have been a routine case resulting in an easy conviction. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering crucial information to a court, I have in my possession, despite Chief Thompson's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my true identity and my completely legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Everyone could sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented, though most didn't yet understand exactly what was happening. Judge Parker was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. What specific kind of documentation are you referring to? Marcus reached carefully into his jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid startling anyone in the increasingly tense courtroom. My official judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office and updated annually. My building access card, programmed with my personal judicial chamber's entry code and biometric security clearance. And my federal judicial identification. Bailiff Henderson suddenly stood up, his face pale as he recognized the man he'd seen every single day for the past 8 years, walking these same halls, entering the same chambers, presiding over the same courtroom where he now sat as a defendant. Your Honor, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to giving orders in courtrooms rather than taking them. I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who exactly Chief Thompson assaulted this morning. He held up a leather credential wallet, and even from across the room, the gold federal judicial seal was clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom. Perhaps we should recess so that proper identifications can be verified through official channels, he suggested, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar procedural suggestions thousands of times before. Judge Parker stared at the credential wallet, then at Marcus's face, then at Bailiff Henderson, who was nodding grimly in confirmation of his worst fears. The color had completely drained from Thompson's face as she began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. Her hands were shaking, her breathing was becoming labored, and her career was flashing before her eyes. Court will recess for 15 minutes, Judge Parker said hoarsely, his voice barely audible in the stunned silence. As the gavel fell with a sound like thunder, Thompson felt her entire world beginning to crumble around her. Whatever game she thought she was playing, she was beginning to realize she might not have understood the rules at all. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse buzzed with nervous energy that spread like wildfire through every corridor, office, and chamber. Word traveled in whispers at first, then in increasingly frantic phone calls and urgent text messages. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Marcus sat calmly while Bailiff Henderson fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as the full reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. "Judge Washington," he whispered, his voice thick with horror and disbelief. "Dear God, Judge Washington, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that." His voice trailed off as he struggled to comprehend how the respected federal judge he'd worked with for years had ended up handcuffed in a holding cell. "It's all right, Henderson," Marcus replied softly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd heard in his courtroom countless times. "You weren't part of Chief Thompson's assault, but I need you to do something very important for me." "Anything, Your Honor. Absolutely anything at all." Marcus looked him directly in the eye with the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated countless defendants over his 25-year career. "I need you to go to my chambers quietly and bring me my judicial robes. The black ones with the gold trim that I wear for formal proceedings." He paused for emphasis. "And Henderson, bring my ceremonial gavel too, the engraved one from my federal appointment ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously and hurried out, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts as he prepared for the most important judicial proceeding of his entire career. Henderson returned carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box, his face still pale with shock and barely controlled anger at what had been done to the judge he'd served faithfully for years. "Your robes, Your Honor, and your ceremonial gavel." Marcus stood and unzipped the garment bag with deliberate care, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been his armor and authority for over 2 decades. As he slipped them on over his civilian clothes, he felt the profound transformation begin. The reckoning was about to begin, and it would be swift, thorough, and absolutely devastating. "All rise!" Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with an authority that made everyone snap to attention immediately. The packed gallery rose as one, but what happened next would be seared into their memories forever. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Marcus Washington presiding. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt of divine justice. Chief Thompson, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, went rigid as if struck by lightning. Judge Parker, still seated in what he now realized was not his chair, turned pale as death and began frantically gathering his papers. Prosecutor Walsh's mouth fell open in shock, her carefully prepared case files scattering to the floor as the full magnitude of the situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. Marcus Washington entered through the judge's chamber door, wearing his full judicial robes with the gold trim catching the overhead lights. He moved with the measured, majestic pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before, his ceremonial gavel held firmly in his right hand. The silence was absolutely complete. Not a single person in the packed courtroom dared to breathe. He took his place behind the bench, and sat down slowly, deliberately, with the kind of controlled dignity that made everyone understand they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of American jurisprudence. His eyes swept the courtroom methodically, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every person who was finally beginning to understand the cosmic magnitude of what had just happened. "Chief Thompson," he said quietly, his voice carrying the full weight of federal judicial authority that had been building for 25 years, "you may remain standing." Thompson looked like she was about to vomit, faint, or both simultaneously. Her face had gone from red to white to green in the span of 30 seconds, sweat beading on her forehead as her entire life crashed down around her. "Your Honor," Judge Parker stammered, rising from his chair with the desperate urgency of someone trying to escape a natural disaster. We didn't... I mean to say..." "Judge Parker," Marcus interrupted, his tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket immediately. I'll handle this matter from here." Parker practically ran from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him, as if he were being chased by the very embodiment of justice itself. Marcus turned his attention back to Thompson, who was now visibly shaking, her legs barely able to support her weight as the full horror of her situation became undeniably clear. "Chief Thompson," he continued, his voice steady and controlled with the precision of someone who had delivered thousands of verdicts, "approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" Thompson's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, no sound emerging from her paralyzed vocal cords. "Let me refresh your memory," Marcus continued with devastating calm. "Since every word you spoke was recorded by our court stenographer and is now part of the permanent legal record." He pulled out a transcript that had been prepared during the recess, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You stated, and I quote exactly, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that under oath?" "Chief Thompson?" Thompson nodded weakly, her legs shaking so violently she could barely remain standing. "You also testified that I was, and I quote, 'another welfare case looking for a handout,' and that you had seen, and I quote, 'this playbook before.' Is that accurate?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like the roar of an approaching storm. Marcus's voice grew colder, more precise, carrying the weight of constitutional authority that could destroy lives with a single word. "And perhaps most memorably, Chief Thompson, you stated under oath that people like me need to learn that, and I quote your exact words, 'actions have consequences.' Do you recall that particular piece of wisdom?" Thompson's knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab onto the prosecutor's table to keep from collapsing entirely. Marcus reached under his bench and pulled out a tablet computer, his movements deliberate and methodical. The technology represented the difference between Thompson's old world of unchecked authority and the new reality of absolute accountability. "Chief Thompson, I'd like to show you some evidence that has come to my attention during our brief recess." He turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom, and Thompson's world exploded into a million pieces. "This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which maintains an unobstructed high-definition view of our main entrance, recording continuously to secure digital storage." The courtroom watched in absolute horror as the morning's events unfolded on screen with crystal clarity. There was Marcus, walking calmly toward the courthouse in his civilian clothes, carrying his briefcase with professional dignity. There was Thompson, emerging like a predator to block his path. Her voice, clear as crystal, filled the courtroom through the tablet speakers. "Another thug trying to sneak into places he don't belong." Several people gasped audibly at the naked hatred in her words. The video continued with horrifying clarity, showing Thompson's unprovoked assault in vivid, undeniable detail. Every person in the courtroom watched as Thompson's open palm cracked across Marcus's face with such force that his head snapped sideways. The sound of the impact was clearly audible, making several spectators wince with sympathetic pain. "Chief Thompson," Marcus said, pausing the video at the moment of impact, "do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats that would justify this assault?" Thompson remained silent, her career and life disintegrating before her eyes with each passing second. "Let's continue watching," Marcus said, resuming the video. The courtroom witnessed Thompson grabbing Marcus's throat and slamming him against the courthouse wall with brutal force. "Trash like you doesn't belong in civilized places." Thompson's own words, spoken with venom and hatred, echoed through the courtroom like a death knell for her career. Several courthouse employees stood up and walked out in disgust, unable to watch any more of the systematic brutality. "Now," Marcus continued with devastating precision, "let's examine your claim that your body camera malfunctioned this morning." He swiped to a new video file, and Thompson's face went completely white. "This is backup footage from your own body camera, automatically uploaded to our county's secure cloud storage system every 60 seconds. A system you apparently forgot existed, Chief Thompson." The new video began playing, and Thompson's voice filled the courtroom again, but this time the audio was even more damning because it captured her private thoughts and motivations. Look at this uppity piece of trash, thinking he can just walk into my courthouse. Thompson's voice snarled through the speakers. These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another lesson. The systematic racism in her private commentary was breathtaking in its openness and brutality. This wasn't just excessive force. It was a hate crime captured in perfect digital clarity. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Davis," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed perjury committed in his own courtroom. "You both testified under oath that Chief Thompson handled this situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to revise those statements now?" Both officers were already edging toward the exit, their confident testimonies revealed as obvious perjury by the video evidence. "And here," Marcus said, advancing the footage to show Thompson's assault from her own body camera perspective, "we can clearly observe the moment when Chief Thompson committed felony assault against a federal judge while he was attempting to perform his constitutional duties." He let those words hang in the air for a long moment, each syllable carrying the weight of federal law. Federal Judge Chief Thompson, not a welfare case, not a criminal, not a trespasser. A federal judge appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate. Thompson's knees finally gave out completely, and she collapsed into the prosecutor's chair, her body shaking with the magnitude of her realization. "But wait," Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that made the tension even more unbearable. "There's additional evidence I'd like the court to consider." He pulled up a new file on his tablet, and Thompson knew her destruction was about to become even more complete. "This is audio from Officer Davis's body camera, which apparently was functioning perfectly this morning, while yours was allegedly malfunctioning." A new voice filled the courtroom, Officer Rodriguez, speaking to Davis while Thompson was assaulting Marcus. "Chief's really going off on this one. Think he's actually somebody important like he keeps saying?" Davis's voice responded with casual cruelty. "Nah, man. Look at him. Thompson knows what she's doing. Probably just another welfare case trying to scam the system." More laughter from the officers as they watched their superior brutalize a federal judge, their conversation revealing the casual racism that permeated their entire approach to law enforcement. The few remaining spectators in the gallery were staring at Thompson with undisguised revulsion. The woman they had once respected as a law enforcement professional was being revealed as a criminal and a racist whose actions had brought shame upon the entire justice system. "Chief Thompson," Marcus said, setting down his tablet with finality, "you asked me earlier if I had any employment verification to prove my right to be in this courthouse." He gestured to the federal judicial seal mounted on the wall behind his bench, then to his nameplate, then to the oil painting of him that hung in the courthouse lobby. "Well, I do have employment verification. I've been the presiding federal judge of this courthouse for 25 years, Chief Thompson. Every case you've ever testified in, every warrant you've ever requested, every search you've ever conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my direct constitutional authority." Thompson finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." Marcus's eyes flashed with controlled fury. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look, Chief Thompson. You saw a black man and you made assumptions based on your own prejudice and hatred." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying enough authority to fill the entire courtroom. "But there's something else you didn't know, Chief Thompson." The courtroom held its collective breath. The reckoning was about to reach its devastating climax. "For the past 10 months, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength and authority with each word, I have been conducting a comprehensive federal investigation into patterns of misconduct and racial bias in this police department, working directly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice." Thompson's face went completely ashen as the full scope of her situation became clear. "This morning's incident wasn't random, Chief Thompson. You have been under federal surveillance, and you just provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could hope for." He lifted his ceremonial gavel and held it before him. The engraved words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all," catching the courtroom lights. "Chief Thompson, you said that actions have consequences. You were absolutely right about that. Marcus stood, his judicial robes flowing around him as he prepared to deliver the most important verdict of his career. Based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony carrying a maximum sentence of 15 years in state prison. The words hit Thompson like physical blows, each charge destroying another piece of her future. I find you guilty of assault on a federal judicial officer. A federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. Thompson's attorney, hastily summoned during the recess, closed his eyes and put his head in his hands, already calculating the decades his client would spend behind bars. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to life in prison when the violation involves attempted kidnapping and assault. With each pronouncement, Thompson seemed to shrink further into her chair, the weight of federal justice crushing her completely. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for your systematic false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Marcus paused, letting the weight of those charges settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. But Chief Thompson, this case was never really about you personally. You are simply a symptom of a much larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. He turned to address the packed gallery, his voice rising with the passion of someone who had dedicated his life to constitutional justice. For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with complete impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid settlements while allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. For too long, we have told victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice isn't for them. His voice filled every corner of the courtroom with righteous authority. But that systematic failure ends today. What happened in this courtroom proves beyond any doubt that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians, no one. Thompson suddenly broke down completely, her body shaking with sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her tears. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant for this to happen." Marcus looked down at her with something that might have been pity, but his voice remained firm and uncompromising. "Chief Thompson, your apology is 25 years and countless victims too late. Your remorse is only appearing now because you finally got caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable for your actions." He lifted his gavel high above his head, the symbol of justice preparing to fall. "But here's what I want you to understand in your final moments as a free woman. Every person you brutalized over the years deserved the same justice I'm delivering today. Every grandfather you called racial slurs, every teenager you planted drugs on, every professional you arrested for existing in the wrong neighborhood, they all deserved to see you held accountable." The gavel hovered in the air as Marcus delivered his final words. "Today, I'm not just delivering justice for myself. I'm delivering justice for every person whose complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated. I'm delivering justice for every family who had to watch their loved ones get brutalized while the system looked the other way." His voice reached its crescendo, filling the courtroom with the power of constitutional authority. "Chief Thompson, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you exactly what my place is. My place is ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives." The gavel came down with a sound like the crack of thunder, final and absolute. "Chief Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by federal law. You will serve 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted in applause that lasted for 5 full minutes. Justice had finally been served, swift and complete. 6 months later, the ripple effects continued transforming the entire justice system. Thompson served her sentence, while her fellow officers faced federal charges. The department was placed under federal oversight, body cameras became mandatory with tamper-proof backup systems, and Marcus's courage inspired a new generation of civil rights advocates. Most importantly, the courthouse where it all happened was renamed the Justice Marcus Washington Federal Courthouse. with a bronze plaque commemorating the morning that changed everything. Here, justice finally found its voice. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations with us. Seeing this global community united for accountability and truth proves that justice is a universal human value. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more stories of courage triumphing over systemic racism. Until next time, remember that no one is above the law. And justice always finds a way.